The sun was still climbing into the sky when James Parker rolled his Lamborghini Urus through the iron gates of Bellbird Park. Morning light glinted across the polished hood, scattering gold flecks across the windshield as if the car itself was announcing his arrival. The neighborhood stretched before him in perfect rows, manicured lawns, million-dollar houses with stone facades, trimmed hedges, and cul-de-sacs designed to radiate exclusivity. For most people, entering such a place would bring comfort. But for James, the sensation was something else entirely, a weight pressed against his shoulders, a crawling awareness that eyes were already on him. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, faces hovered in windows for only a second before vanishing back into shadow. That prickling feeling ran down his neck, the kind of sensation that told him he had just become the subject of neighborhood gossip. It was not curiosity he felt, it was scrutiny. A young black man in a luxury car didn't glide unnoticed into a gated community where most residents were twice his age and more than twice convinced of their superiority. The Urus rolled to a stop in front of number 111, his new home. The house was modern and spacious, with a pale stone exterior and wide glass windows that caught the light. It was supposed to be a day of celebration. He had worked for years to make this possible, coding in small apartments, building a startup from scratch, selling his company for 6 figures, and proving himself in boardrooms where people dismissed him before he even spoke. Buying this home had been a statement, not just to himself, but to a world that constantly told him he didn't belong. He shut off the engine, the quiet clicking of the cooling engine filling the silence. For a brief moment, James allowed himself to breathe, to take in the fact that this was his. No landlord, no uncertainty. His house, his driveway, his car. He reached for the door handle. Then he saw her, a flash of blonde hair in the rearview mirror, designer shades perched like armor, a pastel cardigan over pressed slacks, the kind of outfit carefully chosen to project authority while pretending to be casual. She stormed toward him with clipped strides, her face set in a scowl sharp enough to cut glass. There was no hesitation in her steps, no courtesy of waiting to be introduced. This was not a neighborly greeting. This was confrontation. James stepped out of the car calmly, keys in hand, posture relaxed but alert. The contrast between him and the approaching figure was stark. He was 21, tall, confident, dressed simply in sneakers and a fitted shirt. To anyone else, he looked like a young professional beginning the next chapter of his life. To her, his skin, his youth, and the car he drove formed a picture she refused to accept. The woman's voice pierced the stillness before he could even shut the door. It was shrill, dripping with accusation, carrying down the street as though she wanted every household to hear. She demanded to know who he was, what he was doing there, and how he came to be behind the wheel of a car like that. Her words weren't questions, they were indictments. James remained steady. He introduced himself as the new owner of 1535, moving in that very day. But the woman's expression hardened, her eyes flicking up and down, cataloging every detail of him. The sneakers, the youth, the color of his skin all became evidence in her mind that something was wrong. The pause that followed was thick with unspoken prejudice. Then came the denial. She insisted the Walkers, the previous owners, would never sell to someone like him. The phrase hung in the air, unfinished but heavy, every neighbor who overheard it understanding what she truly meant. Not someone his age, not someone his color, not someone she believed belonged in her curated neighborhood. James didn't flinch. He explained again, voice polite but firm, that the papers had been signed and the deal finalized. He had earned this home, every inch of it, but her eyes narrowed, her tone sharpened. Nobody like him could afford this unless it was stolen. She reached for her phone with dramatic flair, already preparing to summon reinforcements. The moment stretched. On one side, a young man who had spent years proving himself in silence, building wealth not from shortcuts but from sleepless nights of work. On the other side, a woman so certain of her authority that she mistook her prejudice for truth. Around them, the neighborhood stirred, more curtains shifted. A few neighbors stepped outside, pretending to tend to their lawns, but really to witness the brewing storm. The air felt charged, the way it does before a thunderclap. James leaned casually against the Urus, unfazed by her fury. Prejudice wasn't new to him. He had faced it in classrooms, in meetings, in interviews where people shook his hand only to assume he was the intern, not the CEO. Her tone, her glare, her disbelief, it was a script he had heard many times. Yet even knowing what was coming, it stung. This was supposed to be a fresh beginning, but instead it was already a battlefield. The woman barked into her phone, her voice rising theatrically. She described him not as a homeowner, but as a suspicious figure with a luxury car that couldn't possibly be his. She exaggerated, her words dripping with urgency, telling the operator she believed she had caught a criminal in the act. The performance was complete with false alarm. Grand Theft Auto at 1542 Bellbird Park Drive. She gave the address like a prosecutor delivering evidence. When she hung up, her smirk returned. She warned James not to leave, claiming the police would be there any minute. She straightened her shoulders, announced herself as Karen Jones, president of the Bellbird Park HOA, and declared he didn't look like a homeowner. Of course, her name was Karen. The irony almost made James laugh. But laughter couldn't erase the truth. On his first morning in his new home, he wasn't greeted with welcome or warmth. He was met with suspicion, hostility, and the ugly reminder that success didn't shield him from judgment. Even with the keys to $1 million house and the title to a Lamborghini, there were still people who saw only what they wanted to see. The stage was set and the crowd was forming. This was no longer just a confrontation in a driveway. It was becoming a spectacle, one that would soon pull in the flashing lights of patrol cars, the judgment of neighbors, and the relentless documentation of phone cameras. And James, calm and resolute, understood what was happening. This was bigger than him. This was about the narrative she was trying to write, that people like him could not belong in places like this. What she didn't know was that her narrative was about to collapse, and the entire neighborhood would watch it happen. The silence of the street stretched thin as Karen Jones planted herself at the edge of James's driveway. To her, this was not curiosity or neighborly concern. This was intrusion dressed as vigilance, harassment wrapped in the language of order. She circled him with her eyes, looking him up and down like a judge deciding guilt before a trial even began. The Lamborghini Urus gleamed behind him, sunlight flashing across its bold angles, every reflection mocking her disbelief. The sight of him standing so casually against the car seemed to inflame her further. She lifted her phone again, snapping photos of the body, the plate, even stooping low for a shot near the tires. Each click of the shutter carried accusation, as though proof of his crime would appear if she only captured enough angles. It wasn't evidence she was after, it was confirmation of her bias. To her, the sight of a young black man with wealth was crime enough. James didn't move. He watched her calmly, arms resting at his side, posture unshaken. Years of facing this same pattern had taught him that responding with anger only fed their story. He had been mistaken for a valet at his own corporate event, ignored in boardrooms until he revealed his title, followed in stores where he spent more in a single visit than the staff earned in a week. Each moment carried the same undertone. You don't belong here. He recognized it now in the way Karen's gaze lingered on his skin, her voice sharp with practiced superiority. Her tone shifted, pitched louder so the growing audience of neighbors could hear. Nobody your age and nobody like you, she stressed, could possibly own that car legally. She let the words hang like a verdict. To her, suspicion was enough to justify humiliation. One by one, neighbors began drifting outside. A man watering his lawn across the street froze mid-motion, hose still in hand. A woman pushing a stroller slowed to a halt, eyes wide, curtains fluttered and faces appeared in windows. The cul-de-sac, usually quiet on weekend mornings, was filling with spectators drawn to the spectacle of conflict. Karen thrived on the attention. She straightened her cardigan, posture rigid, and announced herself again, this time for the benefit of the audience, president of the Bellbird Park HOA. The title rolled off her tongue like royalty. She declared James's presence suspicious, insisted he didn't look like a homeowner, and repeated the accusation that the car must be stolen. Her words grew bolder with every head that turned toward them. James remained polite, even offering his identification, his house deed, his registration papers. Each document was held out with the same calm assurance that truth was on his side. But Karen didn't even glance at them. She waved them away with disdain, claiming anyone could fake documents. She smirked as she invoked her nephew in cybersecurity, insisting criminals were getting smarter. Every rejection of proof only confirmed that no amount of evidence would satisfy her. The more James tried to keep the situation grounded, in fact, the more determined Karen became to spin it into fiction. She circled the car again, her designer shades glinting in the sun as she crouched low, muttering about illegal money, fake IDs, and dangerous types moving into neighborhoods like ours. Each comment was calculated not just to insult him, but to poison the perception of those watching. She wanted them to believe he was a threat before the police even arrived. James exhaled slowly. This wasn't new, but it still stung. He had bought this home not just as a symbol of success, but as a place to finally breathe without judgment. Yet here he was, his first morning, standing in his own driveway, defending his right to exist there. He tapped out a quick text to his assistant. Running late. Situation with HOA president. Will update. It was a small act of normalcy, a reminder that he still controlled his own narrative, no matter how much Karen tried to rewrite it. Karen's voice rose again, sharper, louder. She turned her body toward the growing crowd, performing her outrage like theater. "I've seen this before," she proclaimed. "A young man flashes wealth he couldn't possibly earn. Then come the drugs, the crime, the danger. Not in my neighborhood, not while I'm HOA president." Her words carried down the block like poison, each phrase designed to stir fear and disgust. Some neighbors looked uneasy, glancing at James with uncertainty. Others shook their heads, recognizing the malice beneath her performance. And still others simply lifted their phones higher, eager to capture the confrontation for social media. The stage was set, the actors in place, and Karen played her role with venomous confidence. James reached calmly into the glove box of the Urus, retrieving the thick folder of documents he had brought for move-in day: registration, insurance, bill of sale. He presented them with steady hands, voice even. He explained he was a tech entrepreneur, that his company had been acquired the year before, that every piece of paper was legitimate. Karen didn't blink. She refused to even glance at the paperwork. She shook her head, lips curling into a sneer. "Anyone can fake documents," she repeated for the crowd. "And I know every homeowner here. I never approved someone like him. He's lying." The irony nearly made James laugh. HOA boards didn't approve buyers. That wasn't how real estate law worked. But she said it with such conviction that some neighbors, unfamiliar with the process, might believe her. That was the danger of confidence paired with prejudice. It disguised lies as truth. The air grew heavier, charged with tension. Neighbors who had once been passive onlookers began shifting uneasily. Some murmured among themselves. The scene had escalated from suspicion to harassment, from quiet prejudice to public performance. Karen's voice rose to a near shout, and with each word, the line between community leader and aggressor blurred further. James stood calm through it all. His voice, when he finally replied, was measured. He reminded her that the HOA didn't approve sales, that the Walkers had accepted his offer legally, that this was his house and his car. But even as he spoke, he knew it wouldn't change her mind. People like Karen weren't searching for truth. They were protecting control. Her cheeks flushed red, her words sharper, her posture defiant. She vowed the police would set everything straight. She promised he wouldn't last long in this neighborhood. She circled the Lamborghini one last time, her disdain so heavy it seemed to cling to the air. The crowd had grown noticeably larger now. Every eye was on them, every phone recording. The drama of the cul-de-sac had become a public trial, and James knew how it would be spun. To Karen, he was already guilty. To the neighbors, he was either a victim of her wrath or the villain of her story. And somewhere beyond the gates, sirens would soon cut through the still morning air. James stood tall in the sunlight, calm and unshaken, waiting for the storm to arrive. The air in the cul-de-sac had thickened with tension, the kind that made even the breeze feel heavy. James leaned casually against the hood of the Lamborghini, arms folded across his chest, his calm demeanor a striking contrast to the storm swirling around him. But calm could not stop what was coming. Karen Jones had already reached for her phone, her voice rising in a performance rehearsed by entitlement. Her words rang out sharp, loud enough for every neighbor on the block to hear. She described James not as a homeowner moving in, but as a suspicious young man with a stolen luxury vehicle. Each phrase was sharpened like a blade. Barely 21. Doesn't belong here. A Lamborghini that can't possibly be his. She even spat out an accusation of grand theft auto, her voice dripping with urgency, as though James were seconds away from fleeing. She gave the dispatcher the exact address, her tone rehearsed, her smirk triumphant as she hung up. When she lowered the phone, the smirk widened into something more dangerous. Her confidence returned like armor. She warned James that police would be here soon, and he'd better not leave. In her mind, the battle was already won. The law, she believed, was on her side. James exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his heartbeat calm. He had faced worse storms than this. A woman with a phone could not rewrite his truth, no matter how loudly she shouted it. Still, he knew what would come next. The flashing lights, the cautious stares, the questions asked with suspicion. He had lived this pattern before, in airports, in neighborhoods, in offices where security eyed him longer than others. He texted his assistant again, "Running late. HOA situation. Don't reschedule yet." Karen wasn't finished. She circled the Lamborghini like a predator, her phone now snapping more pictures, the license plate, the interior through the tinted windows, even stooping low to photograph the rims. Each shutter click echoed across the street. Neighbors, drawn by curiosity, drifted closer. A few crossed their arms, eyes narrowing, unsure of what to believe. Others lifted their own phones, recording silently, capturing the scene for reasons ranging from gossip to evidence. Karen's voice grew louder as the audience grew. She raised her chin, projecting authority, announcing herself once again as president of the Bellbird Park HOA. She claimed she knew every resident personally, claimed James was a fraud, claimed no such homeowner could possibly exist under her watch. She said it with such conviction that a few neighbors furrowed their brows, wondering if perhaps she was right. Confidence, after all, could be contagious, but there were cracks. A woman holding her baby whispered to her husband that the boy seemed calm, too calm for someone who had stolen a car. Another neighbor muttered that Karen had gone too far before, wielding her title like a weapon. Doubt flickered across faces, though no one dared say it aloud with her voice dominating the block. The minutes crawled, the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves felt unnaturally loud. Every glance, every whisper added weight to the silence between Karen's proclamations. James remained steady, leaning against his car, neither defensive nor submissive. His very posture unsettled her. He wasn't behaving like the criminal she wanted him to be. He wasn't afraid. Karen tried harder. She conjured an image for the crowd, warning them that men like James brought danger. She invoked crime, drugs, decline in property values. She wanted fear to spread like fire, but instead it faltered against James's calm. Fear thrives on chaos. Dignity smothers it. And then came the sound. Distant at first, faint enough to wonder if it was only imagination. The low hum of engines, the unmistakable rhythm of patrol cars. Heads turned toward the gates of the neighborhood. Curtains that had closed reopened. Children fell quiet. 2 squad cars eased into the cul-de-sac, tires crunching softly against pavement. Their presence was quiet but commanding, the weight of authority settling over the street. Karen's eyes lit up with smug triumph. She straightened her cardigan, adjusted her shades, smoothed her hair. To her, the arrival was victory. She hurried toward the cars as though she had summoned them like soldiers. Neighbors leaned closer, drawn to the unfolding drama, phones angled higher, recording every second. This was no longer a quiet Saturday in suburbia. It was a stage, and every actor had their role. Karen rushed forward, her voice suddenly sweetened with relief. She thanked the officers loudly, performing for the crowd. She pointed at James, declaring she had caught him red-handed. She insisted he was posing as a homeowner, that she knew every resident, and that he was nothing but a fraud. Her words spilled out quickly like a dam finally broken, eager to cement her narrative before James could speak. James didn't rush, he didn't even step forward. He simply waited, calm, patient, steady, as the officers finally turned toward him. He knew their eyes would weigh him first before their hands touched his documents. He had lived this too many times. The older officer, with a graying mustache and cautious gaze, asked for identification and registration. His tone was measured, professional, but carried the edge of suspicion that came from the call they had received. The younger officer, clipboard in hand, began noting details. James handed over his papers without hesitation. Registration, insurance, deed transfer, everything neat, everything legal, everything his. He didn't argue, he didn't protest. He let the documents speak because experience had taught him that calm truth carried more power than raised voices. The younger officer examined the documents carefully, flipping each page, cross-checking against the system. The older one kept his eyes on James, body angled slightly between him and Karen, as though balancing possibilities in his mind. Karen hovered close, arms folded, her smirk returning as she repeated her claims. Fake documents, stolen car, fraudulent identity. She spoke louder each time, as though volume could cover the cracks forming in her story. The crowd grew thicker. Murmurs rose. Some doubted Karen, some doubted James. All waited for the moment when authority would decide. And James, through it all, stood calm in the sunlight, leaning against his Lamborghini, carrying the dignity of someone who knew the truth would eventually speak louder than lies. The cul-de-sac held its breath as the two squad cars idled at the curb, engines rumbling low, lights flashing in measured rhythm. For years, the neighbors of Bellbird Park had only seen such lights when accidents occurred on the freeway or when storms pulled down power lines. To have them now, circling in front of James Parker's new home, made the air heavy with curiosity and judgment. Karen Jones positioned herself like a general at the center of the battlefield. Her pastel cardigan swayed as she gestured toward James with the triumphant confidence of someone who believed the law existed to enforce her word. Her voice rang sharp, rehearsed, steady. She repeated her claim: James was no homeowner, his car no legitimate possession, his presence no coincidence but a crime waiting to be caught. The phrases rolled off her tongue as if each were a gavel strike sealing his fate. The older officer stepped forward, his mustache shifting as he studied the scene. He looked at James, then at Karen, then at the cluster of neighbors gathered along the sidewalks. His training had taught him to measure situations quickly, but this one felt different. James did not fidget or panic. His posture was steady, his documents already prepared, as though he had expected this very moment. The younger officer took the registration papers and ID with quiet efficiency. He checked each detail, scanning numbers against the system in his handheld device. Minutes stretched as tension thickened. Every beep of the scanner, every flick of his stylus against the screen echoed louder than footsteps. The crowd leaned closer, their murmurs swelling like a low tide. Karen's voice cut through again, insisting the documents were forged, insisting no 21-year-old could legally own property worth millions. She invoked her HOA title as if it were a badge, waving her arms at the car and the house behind James as though claiming jurisdiction over both. She demanded action: arrest, removal, punishment. James said little. His silence was not weakness but strategy. Each calm breath, each quiet nod, each glance at the officers carried a weight of dignity that no accusation could erase. He knew from experience that truth often took longer to be heard than lies, but when it arrived, it carried more force. The younger officer finally looked up. His tone was neutral but precise. The paperwork matched. The car was registered to James Parker. Insurance valid. The deed transfer for the property recorded only weeks earlier. Every record lined up exactly as it should. A ripple of surprise swept through the onlookers. Neighbors who had leaned forward with suspicion now shifted uneasily. A few glanced at Karen, searching her face for an explanation. Karen's cheeks flushed red, but she did not yield. Instead, her voice rose higher, accusing James of hacking systems, of faking records, of trickery beyond ordinary reach. "People like him," she muttered too loudly, and the phrase landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread fast. The older officer's eyes narrowed. His tone shifted, firm and edged with warning. He asked Karen directly what she meant by "people like him." She faltered, trying to redirect, insisting she referred to young people in general. But the pause, the stumble, the way her gaze lingered too long on James's skin told the crowd what words could not hide. From the far end of the street, a neighbor stepped forward. An older man with gray hair and steady eyes raised his phone and offered it to the officers. His doorbell camera had captured Karen's earlier statements, recorded without her knowing. The audio was clear, her voice unmistakable. "We don't need his kind lowering property values." The crowd stiffened. Gasps broke out. The murmurs grew into open whispers of disapproval. Karen's mask of control cracked, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her cardigan buttons as if rearranging fabric could undo words already spoken. The officers listened carefully, their expressions shifting from neutral professionalism to unmistakable recognition. The weight of the evidence was undeniable now. James had not only provided proof of ownership, but also stood witness to the exposure of prejudice that had tried to undo him. The older officer closed his notepad with deliberate calm. He turned toward James, his voice now respectful. "Sir, your documents are in order. You are free to continue." The words carried through the cul-de-sac, landing heavily on every ear. Karen tried to protest, her voice shrill, accusing the neighbor of twisting her words, accusing James of orchestrating the moment. But the crowd had already seen enough. The balance of doubt had shifted. Eyes that once questioned James now looked at Karen with quiet disgust. The flashing lights from the squad cars painted the scene in alternating red and blue. For James, it was a reminder of how quickly life could shift from ordinary to spectacle, from dignity challenged to dignity defended. For Karen, it was the unraveling of an authority she had wielded carelessly for too long. As the officers conferred quietly, noting details for their report, James remained calm, leaning once more against his car. He didn't gloat, didn't provoke, didn't smile. His stillness itself became a statement that truth required no theatrics, only patience and the courage to endure until it was seen. The cul-de-sac buzzed with whispers. Some neighbors lowered their eyes, ashamed of their silence earlier. Others shook their heads, muttering that it had gone too far. And at the center of it all, Karen stood cornered not by walls but by her own words, exposed in front of those she had sought to impress. The confrontation was far from over, but the tide had turned. James had not only defended his right to be there, but also forced the neighborhood to see the prejudice it had harbored, spoken aloud through Karen's voice. The stage was set for what would follow, the unraveling of her authority and the quiet rise of his undeniable truth. The cul-de-sac stood frozen as the younger officer lowered his device and closed the folder of documents. For a moment, only the hum of the patrol cars filled the air, their lights pulsing rhythmically against the perfect facades of Bellbird Park. Red and blue washed across manicured lawns and polished windows, a reminder that order had been disrupted in the very place designed to prevent it. The officer cleared his throat and spoke in a voice firm but calm. Every word carried weight. James Parker's paperwork matched perfectly. The vehicle was his. The insurance was valid. The deed to 1535 Bellbird Park had been legally transferred just weeks earlier. There were no alerts, no red flags, no suggestion of fraud. It should have been the end of the confrontation. A simple declaration of truth. Case closed. But truth, in that moment, did not satisfy Karen Jones. Her face drained of color, then flushed a furious red. She shook her head sharply like a child refusing to hear a lesson. Her voice, once loud with confidence, rose now with desperation. She insisted the records were wrong, that the system must have been hacked. She accused James of trickery, spinning a wild story that bordered on absurdity, but delivered with the same conviction she had carried from the moment she marched across the street. People like him, she muttered again, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that her words carried down the street. That phrase landed heavier this time. The crowd, once skeptical of James, now turned curious eyes toward Karen. They had heard enough of her accusations to sense something more than simple concern. They had seen her dismiss papers without even looking, had watched her circle the Lamborghini like a predator, and now they were witnessing the cracks in her authority widen. The older officer stepped closer, his body language shifting from neutrality to scrutiny. His mustache twitched as he asked what she meant by people like him. Karen stammered, fumbling for cover. She claimed she had meant young people, insisted no one at 21 could afford such luxuries. But her gaze betrayed her, lingering too long on James's skin, her voice quivering with something that no excuse could mask. From the crowd, a ripple of disapproval rose. Some neighbors whispered to each other, their faces tightening with discomfort. Others pulled out their phones, holding them higher, not just recording James now, but focusing on Karen as well. And then came the breaking point. An older neighbor, gray-haired and steady, stepped out from his porch. He crossed the street slowly, phone in hand, and stopped beside the officers. His voice was calm, but it carried the authority of someone who had nothing to gain by lying. He told them his doorbell camera had captured everything from the moment James pulled in. The video showed Karen's words, unedited, undeniable. On the small screen, her voice crackled clearly. "We don't need his kind lowering property values." The words cut through the cul-de-sac like a thunderclap. The crowd gasped, a collective sound of shock and recognition. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it wasn't speculation or whispers. It was evidence, broadcast in her own voice, now echoing in the ears of her neighbors, the officers, and James himself. Karen's composure shattered. She waved her hands wildly, insisting it was out of context, that she had meant standards, not people. Her voice climbed higher, shriller, as she pleaded for the officers to believe her. But the more she spoke, the more the crowd turned. Neighbors who had once nodded along with her HOA rulings now folded their arms and shook their heads. Mothers with children pulled them closer, whispering. Fathers exchanged knowing looks. Years of her domineering presence were unraveling in the span of minutes. James said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence carried more force than any argument. He leaned back against his car, his posture steady, his eyes calm. The documents in the officer's hands, the footage on the neighbor's phone, and the shrill panic of Karen's voice had done all the work for him. The younger officer returned the papers to James with deliberate respect. His tone was clear now, free of suspicion. "Sir, everything checks out. You are free to continue moving in." The crowd shifted. Some nodded approvingly, others muttered quiet apologies under their breath. A few even clapped, though quickly silenced themselves in the charged atmosphere. It was not celebration yet, but it was the first crack of light breaking through the storm. Karen, however, would not relent. Her cheeks blotched crimson, her voice pitched higher than ever. She demanded the officers run it again, accused them of being fooled, threatened to call their superiors. She pointed at James, insisting the community would fall apart if people like him were allowed in. Each word she spoke only deepened her isolation. The older officer's patience thinned. He told her firmly to step aside. His tone carried warning now, sharper than before, the kind of voice that let everyone know the line had been crossed. The crowd was no longer on her side. Murmurs turned to open criticism. "She's gone too far. Always picking fights. Never thought it would come to this." Years of tension, small grievances, and unspoken frustrations spilled into the open. Her power, once unquestioned, was dissolving in the eyes of the very people she claimed to represent. James stood quietly, his breathing steady, his expression controlled. This was not victory in his eyes, it was survival. He had wanted only to move into his home, to start a new chapter. Instead, his dignity had been tested before neighbors, officers, and strangers with cameras. The relief of vindication was tempered by the knowledge that prejudice had forced the confrontation in the first place. Still, the balance had shifted. Authority no longer leaned toward Karen. The law, the crowd, and the evidence now stood on James's side. The Lamborghini gleamed in the sunlight, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but of truth. The young man beside it, once accused of theft, now stood as the rightful homeowner. And Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, found herself exposed, her voice no longer commanding, but desperate. The turning point had come, and the street would never forget it. The doorbell footage had changed everything. What had begun as Karen Jones's performance of authority now turned into her public undoing. The neighbor held the phone steady as the recording played again, her voice unmistakable, her words too sharp to be excused as misunderstanding. "We don't need his kind lowering property values." Those words, crisp and clear, cut through the heavy summer air. The officers heard them, the neighbors heard them, James heard them, and there was no pulling them back. The crowd stiffened, whispers breaking out like sparks in dry grass. Some shook their heads, muttering about how they'd always suspected she thought that way. Others simply stood silent, the weight of the words sinking into their bones. For years, Karen had ruled this community with her titles and letters and threats of fines. But now, the very power she wielded so freely was crumbling in her hands. Karen's response was frantic. She flailed her hands in protest, waving the footage away as taken out of context. She claimed she was talking about community standards, about young people, about rules, about order, but her voice betrayed her. The shrill panic in her tone was not the voice of authority, it was the voice of fear. And the more she spoke, the less anyone believed her. The older officer remained steady, his eyes locked on her as though seeing her for the first time. He asked her calmly if she had, in fact, called the police under the claim of a stolen vehicle. She admitted she had. He asked if she had dismissed James's documents without even looking. She admitted again, though reluctantly. Each question pinned her tighter, each admission tightening the noose of accountability. Meanwhile, James stood silent by his car. His Lamborghini Urus still gleamed, a symbol of legitimacy against her accusations. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to argue. Every moment he stayed calm, every breath he took in silence made Karen's unraveling louder. The younger officer, still holding James's documents, confirmed once more that everything checked out. He emphasized the legality of the car, the insurance, the deed. His words were clear. There was no crime, no fraud, no suspicion. James was exactly who he said he was. Karen tried again, desperation sharpening her tone. She accused the system of being hacked, accused James of orchestrating a trick, accused the neighbor of tampering with footage. Her theories grew wilder with each sentence, her hands trembling as she gestured wildly to the crowd. But the crowd no longer nodded along. They watched with narrowed eyes, arms crossed, lips tight. For years, she had shamed them with letters about weeds too tall, lawns not trimmed, garbage bins left out an hour too long. She had fined families for minor infractions, threatened lawsuits for parked cars, and treated every rule like a weapon. Now, for the first time, they watched her flounder, and many of them savored it. The older officer closed his notepad and spoke with finality, his voice carried across the cul-de-sac, slicing through Karen's protests. The matter of ownership is settled. Mr. Archer is the lawful resident of this property. His vehicle is registered and insured. There is no further question here. The crowd shifted audibly. Shoulders dropped, breaths released, murmurs rose. It was done. James had been vindicated. But the officer wasn't finished. He turned to Karen, his voice sharper now, no longer neutral. He explained that filing a false police report was a misdemeanor offense. He reminded her that wasting police resources endangered real emergencies. And he added that harassment rooted in discrimination carried consequences, especially when recorded and witnessed by an entire neighborhood. Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing without sound. For a woman who had always thrived on control, the realization that control had slipped from her hands was unbearable. Her eyes darted from the officers to the neighbors, searching for support. None came. The mother with the stroller turned her back. The man with the hose shook his head. Teenagers raised their phones higher, recording every second. Even the neighbors who had once supported her authority now stood in silence, unwilling to defend what they had just heard with their own ears. The younger officer stepped aside, making space. The older officer gestured firmly for Karen to stand still. He began writing in his notepad, each stroke of his pen deliberate, unhurried, final. She demanded to know what he was writing, her voice breaking into shrieks of disbelief. But the answer came plainly, an official citation, a record of her false report, a note of her discriminatory harassment. The crowd buzzed again. Some neighbors whispered that they'd never seen her so powerless. Others chuckled quietly, shaking their heads at the spectacle. For once, Karen wasn't the judge, she was the judged. James remained quiet, his expression unreadable. Inside, the relief washed over him like cool water after standing in fire. But he didn't gloat, he didn't smile or smirk. His dignity was his victory, and he would not tarnish it by lowering himself to her level. The officers finished their report, handed her the citation, and explained the process. Karen tried to argue, but her words fell flat. The crowd had already rendered its verdict. Neighbors looked at James differently now, not with suspicion, but with quiet respect. Some even nodded at him, a gesture of apology for their earlier silence. Karen, red-faced and trembling, stood in the center of the cul-de-sac with her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. The power she had once wielded like a crown now felt like a chain dragging her down. Her reign had ended not with applause, but with silence, the silence of a community that no longer believed in her authority. The flashing lights painted her figure in red and blue. For James, the lights no longer felt like a threat. They felt like closure. The truth had been revealed, her prejudice exposed, her power broken. But deep down, he knew this was not the end. There would be fallout, letters, meetings, attempts to salvage control. Yet the tide had shifted, and Karen could not erase what the world had witnessed. The exposure was complete. She had wanted the spotlight, and now it burned her. The flashing lights eventually dimmed. The officers filed their report, folded it into their clipboard, and climbed back into their squad cars. Engines rumbled, tires rolled across the pavement, and the patrol cars disappeared through the iron gates of Bellbird Park. For the first time all morning, the cul-de-sac was quiet, but it was not the same quiet as before. The silence now was heavy, reflective, filled with the weight of what had just unfolded. Neighbors lingered in clusters, whispering in low tones. Phone cameras, still warm from recording, were slipped back into pockets. The stares that once hovered over James had shifted entirely onto Karen Jones. She stood alone in the center of the street, pastel cardigan drawn tightly around her shoulders, face blotched with red. The title she had wielded like a weapon, president of the HOA, sounded hollow now, almost laughable in the wake of her exposure. For years, she had been the enforcer of order. She had written fines for garbage cans left out too long. She had issued warnings for grass half an inch too high. She had chastised families for too many guests at holiday gatherings, and neighbors, tired of fighting, had submitted. Some had even admired her commitment to rules, mistaking fear for leadership. But this morning shattered the illusion. They had heard her words, dripping with prejudice, caught in high definition by a doorbell camera. They had seen her call the police on an innocent man, dismiss his documents without looking, insist that people like him did not belong. There was no letter she could write, no fine she could issue, no meeting she could hold to erase what the entire street had witnessed. Karen's hands shook as she tried to retreat with dignity. But dignity is a fragile mask. It cracked with each step she took, her heels clicking too fast against the pavement. The neighbors' eyes followed, not with sympathy but with quiet condemnation. Some shook their heads, others turned their backs. A few simply folded their arms, letting the silence speak louder than words. James remained by his car. His Lamborghini gleamed in the sunlight, its metallic body untouched by the storm of accusations. He leaned against it, posture calm, expression steady. Vindication was his, not by shouting, not by proving himself in anger, but by letting truth stand unshaken while lies collapsed under their own weight. When Karen finally disappeared into her house, the street seemed to exhale. Conversations broke out, some directed toward James now. A few neighbors approached timidly, offering small gestures, an apology here, a nod of respect there. One man muttered that he was sorry for staying silent at first. A woman with her baby thanked him for staying calm, admitting that the whole confrontation had made her ashamed of the community's behavior. James accepted each with quiet grace. He didn't gloat, he didn't scold. His calm presence spoke volumes. The message was clear. He wasn't here to pick fights or challenge authority. He was here because he belonged, just as much as anyone else, perhaps more for having endured what he had that day. Days later, the fallout began. Word of the confrontation spread beyond the cul-de-sac. The video of Karen's remarks, clipped from the neighbor's doorbell cam and teenagers' live streams, circulated online. It didn't take long before it reached local news, then regional outlets. Headlines painted the picture clearly. Joy President calls cops on Black homeowner exposed by video. Bellbird Park was thrust into the spotlight, its carefully cultivated image of exclusivity now tainted by scandal. The HOA board scrambled, an emergency meeting was called. Neighbors packed into the clubhouse, some out of curiosity, others with pent-up grievances, finally ready to surface. The board read the charges. Karen had filed a false report, publicly harassed a resident, and disgraced the community with discriminatory remarks. Her face burned as she tried to defend herself, claiming she had been misunderstood, that she was only protecting property values. But murmurs rose from the crowd, drowning her out. The vote was swift and unanimous, 27-0. Karen Jones was stripped of her role as president, suspended from all HOA duties, and fined heavily for her conduct. The consequences did not end there. Karen worked in real estate, her agency once bolstered by the prestige of her position in the community. But clients, seeing the viral footage, began withdrawing their listings. One by one, her business partners distanced themselves, unwilling to be tied to her scandal. Within weeks, she was placed on leave, her career crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance. James, meanwhile, settled quietly into his new home. He continued his routines, unfazed by the whispers that still circled Bellbird Park. He knew not everyone would change overnight. Prejudice did not vanish with a single confrontation, but the balance of power had shifted. He had been tested publicly and emerged with dignity intact, while Karen's empire of control had collapsed in front of the very people she thought she ruled. The final humiliation came weeks later. James ran into her at the grocery store. She was no longer the polished woman in designer shades and pastel cardigans. Her shoulders were hunched, her expression weary, her cart half filled with groceries she abandoned the moment she saw him. Her face flushed red, and she hurried toward the exit, leaving her things behind. James watched silently as she fled. He didn't chase her, didn't smirk, didn't speak. Her flight was enough. She had once been the loudest voice in the neighborhood, the one who believed power was hers by right. Now she couldn't even meet his eyes. For years, she had built her identity on control. She had mistaken authority for superiority, mistaking fear for respect. But when exposed under the unforgiving light of truth, it all crumbled, faster and more completely than anyone imagined. The neighbors of Bellbird Park never forgot that morning. Some remembered the way Karen's voice cracked when her prejudice was revealed. Others remembered the calm way James leaned against his Lamborghini, his composure unbroken. But all remembered the moment the power shifted, when arrogance gave way to justice. And James? He carried no bitterness. He had faced bias before, and he knew he would again. But in that cul-de-sac, on that bright morning, he had proven something larger than himself. That prejudice could be exposed, that dignity could endure, and that justice, though slow, could catch up to those who abused power. Karen had tried to write him out of the story of Bellbird Park. Instead, she had written herself out, her fall recorded, shared, and remembered. And in her place, James stood, not just as a homeowner, but as a quiet reminder that no one decides where you belong but you.